"That old dog can't keep up," Reed Pennington said, loud enough for the whole gate line to hear it, and he said it looking at Birch instead of at Alton, which told you everything about where he thought the conversation belonged. A leather sleeve hung from Alton's offhand, wrapped in a feed sack, carried onto the grounds the way it had been carried onto the grounds every session for 2 months, and never once slipped over a forearm, never once offered to the dog's mouth. Nobody at the gate could have told you why. The registry had Birch listed as retired, non-competitive class, joint failure, age 7, and it had stamped that finding 2 years back with the flat, unappealable confidence of a database that had never once watched him move. The standing record on the obstacle and scent course belonged to an active-duty SEAL team dog, 4 minutes 11 seconds, set 18 months prior and unbeaten since by anyone still allowed to attempt it. The advisory board convened in 3 days to decide, among other things, whether Cutback Ridge kept its scoring contract for another 2 years. None of the candidates lined up that morning knew any of these numbers belonged in the same sentence. If you've ever watched someone written off before their run was done, you already know how this course ends. Alton Dunbar was 74 years old and had the look of a man who had already decided the morning's opinion of him was not his problem to manage. He wore coveralls with a Kennel Supply Company's name stitched over the breast pocket, a company that had gone out of business before Reed Pennington was born, and he carried his right shoulder low and fixed, never lifting past the height of his own collarbone, so that he led Birch always with his left hand and reached for nothing overhead. Birch stood beside him at a loose heel, ears up, reading the yard, the wind coming off the tree line. The new dog 3 runs down, favoring a shoulder himself, the handler at post 4 who hadn't slept, well before Alton had finished scanning it the same way. That was the order those two had always worked in. The dog found the trouble first. The man decided what to do about it. Before dawn that morning, in the kitchen of a house on 5 acres with a coop out back and a porch that faced east, Nadine Dunbar had wrapped that same sleeve in a clean feed sack and set it by the door where Alton would trip over it if he tried to leave without it. 49 years of marriage had refined this down to a habit neither of them discussed anymore. She didn't ask him what he meant to do with it. She asked him if he'd eaten, and whether Birch had, and whether he'd remembered the water jug. 3 questions that were really one question, asked the same way most mornings, answered the same way most mornings, and underneath all 3 of them was something neither of them had needed to say out loud in a long while. He'd kissed the side of her head on his way out, the way a man does a thing he has done so many thousand times it no longer needs deciding. Birch had already been standing at the truck door before Alton reached it, tail low and steady, watching the tree line beyond the drive, as if he already knew which direction the day's trouble was coming from. Reed Pennington's laugh at the gate wasn't cruelty so much as it was certainty, the particular kind that comes from a young man who has never yet been wrong about something in front of a crowd. He had a laminated run sheet clipped to his belt, and candidates were already watching him, the way candidates watch a man they intend to become. He didn't look at Alton again. He looked past him, toward the obstacle line, toward the morning's real work, and he said it a second time for the benefit of the 2 nearest recruits, as if the first delivery hadn't quite landed. "That old dog can't keep up. Not on this course, not with a joint file like that behind him." Birch didn't flinch. Neither did Alton. The sleeve stayed wrapped in its feed sack, and the morning went on as if nothing at all had just been decided by everyone, except the 2 who would actually have to answer for it. Reed's real work started 20 minutes later, and it deserved watching, because there was nothing false in it. A young handler named Out of the Seal Track Pipeline stood at the head of the course with a 9-month-old dog who hadn't yet run it clean, and Reed walked the 2 of them through it stride by stride, calling gate positions off the laminated sheet without glancing down at it twice, correcting the handler's lead hand, timing the scent box by feel a half-second before the gantry confirmed it. The dog ran it in 4:50, a real number, an honest improvement, and Reed's praise for the young handler was specific and earned, and entirely without performance in it. The kind of coaching a man gives when no one is grading him for giving it. Whatever else was true about Reed Pennington, he had not lied his way into that post. He had built something real underneath the leaderboard, even if the leaderboard was the only thing he had been taught to trust. It was only after, walking back toward the gate with the run sheet still clipped at his hip, that Alton caught him and asked, plainly, whether he might walk Birch through the obstacle and scent course, not for time, not for record, just to walk it, the way a handler walks a dog through ground he used to know. Reed didn't even reach for the clipboard right away. He'd already memorized the line. Retired, non-competitive class, he said. Joint failure flagged at 7, and the course insurance didn't extend to dogs outside an active working designation. Board policy. Nothing personal. He said, board policy the way other men said, act of God. Something with no author and no appeal. Alton listened to the whole of it without interrupting, the way a man listens to weather he has no intention of arguing with, and when Reed finished, all Alton said was that he understood, and thanked him, and turned back toward the truck, the sleeve still riding under his arm in its feed sack, still untouched. Zane Bledsoe watched the whole exchange from the fence line with the particular attentiveness of a young handler still deciding who in this place was worth learning from. He was 24, a year into the course, assigned that season to shadow Reed, and he had absorbed enough of the leaderboard language already to know a policy citation when he heard one recited instead of explained. What he could not stop watching was Birch, who had sat the instant Alton stopped walking and had not moved since, weight even, ears tracking the far paddock where a training group was working a bite drill, utterly unlike any dog Zane had ever seen filed under joint failure. He found himself drifting closer over the next hour, not to interrupt, just to watch, the way you watch a thing you suspect you're not yet equipped to name. What he saw was 3 gate drills, run quietly, off to the side of the main course, where nobody official was keeping time. Alton unwrapped the sleeve from the feed sack for the first time all morning, held it at his hip, and worked Birch through a sequence that had nothing to do with speed: approach, hold position, release on a hand signal barely wider than a twitch, return to heel. The dog's eyes never left the sleeve, and never once tried to close his jaw on it. Zane had seen plenty of handlers work a bite sleeve. He had never seen a dog offered one and asked. Instead, only to look at it, to trust that it would still be there, to sit with wanting something and not take it until told. Alton's hands did the same 4 things in the same order each time, patient as a man setting a level, and when Reed drifted past for the second time that hour and told Alton, not unkindly this time but no more warmly either, that unauthorized personnel needed to keep training dogs off the certified lanes, Alton only stepped Birch 2 strides further back into the grass and said that they'd stay off the lanes, then, and kept working. The third gatekeeping came an hour after that, sharper, Reed trailing 2 of the morning's candidates behind him, like an audience he hadn't quite invited, but wasn't discouraging either, asking whether Alton understood that continued presence on the grounds without an active handling credential could be treated as a liability concern the course would have to log. Alton didn't argue the credential. He didn't mention the 22 years, or the discharge, or anything that might have answered the challenge on its own terms. He said only that a dog remembers what he's asked to trust, long after anyone stops asking him to prove it. And then, he clipped Birch's lead and walked him a slow, wide loop around the outside of the fence, out of everyone's way, the sleeve back in its sack, the whole exchange over inside of 20 seconds. Zane found that he had stopped taking notes on Reed's run sheet method sometime in the last hour and started, without deciding to, taking notes on the dog instead. By early afternoon, a rumor had done what rumors do at a place like Cutback Ridge, traveling faster than any of the actual facts underneath it, and a knot of instructors and candidates had gathered loosely near the obstacle and scent course under the pretense of watching the next scheduled run. Reed arrived at the head of it with the run sheet still clipped at his belt, and when he saw Alton standing at the gate with Birch seated calm beside him, sleeve nowhere in sight, he made the offer the way a man makes an offer he's certain will end the conversation for good. "Fine," he said, since apparently this needed settling, 1 unofficial pass, off the books, no record, no liability, just so everyone here could see for themselves what the file already said. Alton only nodded, unclipped Birch's working lead, and knelt, carefully, favoring nothing but his right shoulder, to speak 2 low words no one but the dog was close enough to hear. What happened over the next 4 minutes and 6 seconds happened almost too plainly to be dramatic, which was itself the strange part. Birch went through the low wall without breaking stride, worked the scent boxes in an order that read like memory rather than search, cleared the elevated balance run at a gate Zane would later describe to another handler as unhurried, threaded the tunnel stack, and came off the final obstacle, already angling for the alert post before the gantry had finished its countdown tone. The readout blinked once, held, and then refreshed itself, because the number sitting on the board did not match anything the system expected to display for a dog logged as retired, non-competitive. 4 minutes 6 seconds, 5 seconds under the standing record set by an active SEAL team's dog 18 months before. The gantry operator, a young civilian tech nobody had thought to name all morning, called for a manual re-verification, checked the sensor gates by hand, and ran the confirmation twice, because the system's own error checking had flagged the result as statistically implausible for a dog of Birch's registered condition. Both rechecks returned the same 6 seconds. The crowd that had gathered to watch Reed settle something instead went quiet, in the particular way a crowd goes quiet when it realizes the thing it came to laugh at just finished proving something else entirely. Reed stood with the run sheet still in his hand, and for a moment he didn't look at the readout at all. He looked at Birch, who had trotted back to Alton's side and sat, tongue out, chest working, entirely unbothered by what he had just done, the way a dog is unbothered by anything a stopwatch decides about him. Alton knelt again, the same careful economy of motion, and rested his hand flat against the dog's ribs, feeling the breathing settle, saying nothing at all, because there was nothing left in that moment that needed saying. It did not last. Within the hour, the registry system itself intervened, where no human at the gate had been willing to, because Birch's designation as retired, non-competitive class carried no field for a live re-entry, and the software flagged the run as provisionally void pending administrative review. Not a judgment on the time, the tech explained, apologetic, just a hole in the paperwork nobody had built a bridge across. Reed seized the technicality with visible relief, the relief of a man handed back solid ground, and repeated it twice to the thinning crowd. Provisional, unofficial, off the books, exactly as agreed before the run. By early evening, Director Grantham had called the course office directly, and by the following morning he was on the grounds in person, informing the gantry team in clipped, unhurried language that the result would need to be stricken from any log ahead of Thursday's quarterly review, given the liability exposure of an unauthorized, non-credentialed animal on an active certification course. He said liability exposure the way Reed had said board policy, an authorless weather system nobody could be asked to argue with. Zane Bledsoe, meanwhile, had gone looking for something simpler than an argument. He wanted the veterinary file behind the joint failure flag, expecting paperwork, expecting an exam date, an X-ray series, a vet's signature, the ordinary skeleton of a medical retirement. He found none of it. The retirement record showed only a system-generated flag, time-stamped to the same fiscal quarter as an equipment order from a scoring software vendor. No attached exam, no attending veterinarian's name anywhere in the file. He sat with that for a long while before he understood what he was actually looking at, and it cost Alton something in that same stretch of hours, not the record, which still stood on paper only provisionally, but the taste of a public setback landing exactly when vindication had seemed, for one afternoon, close enough to touch. Command Master Chief Weldon Gaines arrived on Thursday morning in a plain sedan, 68 years old, retired from the Navy a decade prior, and seated on the course's advisory board for 3 of those years. A man nobody at Cutback Ridge had thought to connect to anything happening on the training grounds that week. He walked in already mid-conversation with 2 other board members, discussing agenda items in the flat cadence of a man who had sat through 100 quarterly reviews and expected this one to run like all the rest. Reed Pennington, called in early to explain the disputed run before the full board convened, had gotten exactly 4 sentences into his prepared account: the registry classification, the liability exposure, the provisional void, when Gaines, crossing the room toward his seat, stopped walking entirely. He was looking past Reed at the man standing quietly near the back wall in coveralls with a defunct company's name stitched over the pocket, a dog sitting calm at his side. Gaines said one word, low, not a question, a designation, the kind stamped on old orders and old memories both, unused in this room in decades. And then he said nothing else for a long moment, because there was nothing else immediately available to say. He crossed the remaining distance without acknowledging the board, without acknowledging Reed mid-sentence, and set his hand briefly on Alton's good shoulder, the left one, the one that still rose without complaint. Reed's sentence died somewhere around the word liability, and never restarted. He stood holding the laminated run sheet like a man who has just discovered the paper in his hand weighs considerably less than he thought it did. Gaines didn't explain himself right away either. He asked Alton, instead, whether the dog was the one from the run everyone on the grounds had been talking about since Tuesday, and when Alton said only that his name was Birch, Gaines nodded slowly, the way a man nods at a fact he has just filed somewhere permanent, and turned to the rest of the board to say that the man standing in the coveralls had built the very obstacle and scent course they were all about to argue over, calibrated the original timing gantry himself, 30-some years back when the grounds had still been a forestry station and the course had been drawn on the back of a supply requisition. Nobody in the room, Gaines added, had been in a position to know that this morning, himself included, until he'd walked in and seen a face he hadn't expected to see again in this lifetime. While the board absorbed that, Zane made his way to the front with a folder he had assembled the night before and hadn't slept much to finish. He laid it flat in front of Director Grantham rather than handing it to him, a small deliberate choice, and said only that the retirement flag on Birch's file carried no veterinary signature anywhere in its history, only a software timestamp matching the same quarter as an equipment purchase order from Meridian's vendor of record. The same vendor, the folder showed, in which Director Grantham held a paid consulting arrangement never disclosed to the board that had approved the original contract 3 years prior. Grantham's face did the work his voice tried not to. He reached for the folder, closed it, and said something about needing to review the documentation properly before any conclusions were drawn. But the room had already drawn them, and everyone in it, including Grantham, understood that the review Thursday was no longer about a disputed stopwatch reading at all. The board asked Alton to speak, not as a formality, but because Gaines requested it directly, and Alton stood the way he stood for everything, weight settled, right shoulder fixed and low, and did not raise his voice to fill the room the way a man does when he suspects the room doubts him. He told them plainly that he had trained Birch through his active years and had been there the day the joint issue was first flagged, 2 years back, and that no one, not himself, not any veterinarian, not anyone wearing a stethoscope, had ever examined that joint before the retirement notice came down. He said he had believed the flag anyway, at first, because paperwork wears an authority a man's own eyes sometimes doesn't, and it had taken him the better part of 2 years of watching Birch move through ordinary mornings to understand that the dog's body had never once agreed with what the file said about it. He told them about the sleeve last, because it was the part that mattered least to the registry and most to everything else. He said he'd made it himself 30 years back, restitched twice since, and that he had carried it onto these grounds every session for 2 months and never once let Birch take hold of it, because a dog that has been told he is finished stops believing his own body before anyone else does. And the last thing Alton had wanted was to hand Birch a task he might fail at while he was still deciding whether trying was worth the risk. He hadn't come back, he told them, to prove the dog could still run the course. He'd come back so the dog wouldn't die believing he'd failed at something he never actually failed at all. The room held that sentence the way a room holds very little else all year. Reed Pennington didn't say much after that, which was itself the whole of his answer. He asked Zane quietly, once the board session broke for the afternoon, to walk him through the retirement file line by line, and listened without interrupting, and when he next drafted a session plan for the younger handlers under his supervision, he added, without being asked, a standing requirement that any joint-related retirement flag be confirmed by an outside veterinary exam before it could be entered as final. A single line in a training manual. Unglamorous. Permanent. He also asked Zane, directly, whether he'd mind reviewing Reed's run sheets going forward before each session. Not as oversight, but because, he said, he'd rather learn to read a dog the way Zane apparently already could than keep reading a laminated card instead. The board referred Director Grantham's consulting arrangement to a formal compliance review that same afternoon. The vendor contract's renewal tabled pending its outcome, and nobody in the room needed telling twice what that outcome was likely to be. The compliance review took the better part of 6 weeks, longer than anyone expected, though shorter than Grantham's lawyer would have liked. When it closed, the vendor contract was not renewed. The retirement procedure was rewritten to require an attending veterinarian's signature on any joint-related flag, and Birch's file was formally corrected to active, working, non-competitive by owner's choice, a small phrase, but the only one that mattered, because it meant the record now agreed with what the dog had always known about himself. The course record on the obstacle and scent circuit stood exactly where the gantry had clocked it, 4 minutes 6 seconds, unchallenged since, credited in the official log to a handler and dog pairing that had, by then, quietly gone home. Home was 5 acres, with a coop out back and a porch facing east, and Alton returned to it the way he returned to most things, without ceremony. Nadine met him at the door the evening the corrected registry page arrived in the mail, read it twice at the kitchen table with her glasses pushed up into her hair, and said only that it was about time somebody put that in writing, before she folded the page along its crease and set it in the drawer of the hall table, where important things went to rest once they were finished being urgent. Birch, for his part, had already found his spot on the barn floor by then, worn smooth by 2 years of afternoons, and required no ceremony either. The leather sleeve went back on its nail inside the barn door, the same nail it had hung on for 30 years, before this spring interrupted it, its bite pattern worn into a shape no factory sleeve had ever matched, and none ever would. Some evenings now, Alton took it down anyway, out of habit more than necessity, and let Birch work the same 4 quiet motions they'd built together at the gate that spring. Hold, wait, release, return. Not because the dog needed proving anymore, to himself or to anyone with a stopwatch, but because some rituals outlived the reason they were built for. On the evening this story properly ends, the sleeve hung back on its nail, Birch asleep across Alton's boots, with his breathing slow and even, and the corrected registry page rested folded in the drawer beneath, where the sleeve had hung, nothing left in that barn that needed proving to anyone. Some records are only broken to prove the ones before them were never lies.